If alien spacecraft ever were to crash on planet Earth, then the US government would probably want to retrieve them. If they did, they would need to employ at least a few dozen people to make this possible, and we can reasonably speculate that those people would be sworn to secrecy. But what would happen if someone were to talk? That's exactly what someone did, blowing the lid off a case dating back to the era of the Cold War. My name is Aaron Deese, and joining me once again are Mark Matsky, Micah Hanks, Katie Page, Heather Mosier, and Ron Murphy. Today on UFOs Revisited, we'll be discussing and speculating on exactly what the purpose was of Project Moondust. So let's start as we usually do. What do we know about Project Moondust?
So we know that Project Moondust was started in 1953 by the U.S. Air Force with the idea to locate, recover, and deliver descended foreign space vehicles. What's interesting about this is that we're still 4 years out from Sputnik launching, so the idea that we needed this program in the first place is kind of interesting. And then we have the author and retired captain of the Reserve Air Force, Kevin Randle, who has said that Project Moondust took up the helm after Blue Book came about. When Blue Book became too public, then Moondust came over. And that Moondust is actually still persistent to this day. It's just under a different name now, since now we are talking about Project Moondust.
You know, Project Blue Book, of course, being the known U.S. Air Force investigation, really the longest-running systematic investigation of unidentified flying objects that is known to exist by any government. But that beginning really in 1953, the two predecessor organizations, Project Sign and then Project Grudge. But Blue Book gets underway really around 1953, lasting until about 1970. Now, the contention has always essentially been that while the U.S. Air Force was officially investigating unidentified flying objects throughout the 1950s and 60s, that they had also been kind of engaged in, rather than so much an investigation, kind of more of a public relations exercise. Really quickly, to explain what I mean by that, in 1952 we'd had the Robertson panel that convened a group of scientists, and this was basically sponsored by the CIA, and they wanted to try and have scientists look at this phenomenon. Most of them, J. Allen Hynek, who of course would be the science advisor to Project Blue Book, had been present, but they had essentially determined at that time, we're not convinced that there are really aerial objects and really compelling evidence that we're collecting about them. What we're more concerned about is the possibility that foreign adversaries might use U.S. interest in UFOs as a way that we could perhaps clog communication channels or something in advance of an attack or some other kind of an operation. And so the United States was concerned about the possibility that widespread interest in the phenomenon might be leveraged by our adversaries. And their response to this is to preemptively try and educate the public. And they literally call for, the recommended education program to try and maybe even use things like Walt Disney Productions and this sort of thing to educate the public on critical thinking and the fact that the United States Air Force usually in most cases can explain all these cases and that there's not really much to see here. That's going to help lower the temperature on public interest. It's going to reduce the work that the Air Force has to do, and overall it's going to increase our chances of being able to spot any kind of foreign efforts to leverage that interest in advance of some of the kind of ulterior motive. Now, that didn't end up happening, right? The public was often very critical. Sometimes elected officials were quite critical of Blue Book and their responses. Maybe one of the best known examples when, in I believe 1966, J. Allen Hynek, sort of pressured by the Air Force to make a statement about a series of sightings made by Michiganians, had said it could have been swamp gas. Then elected official Gerald Ford, who would go on to become president, of course, he was very unhappy, and he said, I don't like the Air Force and their scientists going out there and telling Michigan citizens what they did or did not see. If they're seeing things, let's really investigate it. And in truth, I think that a lot of the investigations back then were really, pretty paltry. I mean, phone calls would be made even when a sighting, and a good one, occurred within a reasonable distance of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So a lot of people had these issues with Project Blue Book and there being a lacking of real investigation. But some would contend that while this was the public side of the U.S. Air Force's investigations, when actual foreign objects fell, there might have been another program, something that was a little bit more behind the scenes, maybe a classified program that was involved in the direct retrieval and acquisition of these foreign technologies. And that's kind of where Project Moondust comes into the equation.
Well, much of what we know about Project Moondust, outside of some of these documents that have been declassified, comes from a man named Sergeant Clifford Stone, who alleges that he worked with the program. He wrote a book in 2011 called Eyes Only, The Story of Clifford Stone and UFO Crash Retrievals. And in it, he says, again, that he worked with this project for several years, that he was initially told, you're being tasked with retrieving Soviet technology. But as he began to encounter these devices and the apparently living occupants that some of them housed, he began to question whether or not that was a possibility. One statement Stone made that I find very compelling for a number of reasons, and this is a quote: "I am prepared to state that I've been at locations where craft of unknown origin that did not originate on this planet were there. I am prepared to state that while I was there, we saw living and dead bodies of entities that were not born on this planet." There's an interesting verbiage he uses here, and I find the similarity to what we're hearing now in some of these congressional statements of non-human intelligences. That's interesting. He doesn't say extraterrestrial, he says not born on this planet. He doesn't use the term alien. He says entities not born on this planet. What are our thoughts on that?
I mean, recently we've even heard members of Congress making statements. Anna Paulina Luna, Tim Birch of Tennessee, and others, who have said interdimensional, extraterrestrial. I mean, they're using some very interesting language for elected officials to be using coming out of classified briefings on Capitol Hill. And it's not to say that necessarily that's what the reality of this is. It's the fact that even discussion of those possibilities, that's part of this, says two things. It's an extraordinary time in which we're living, right? And naturally there's a reason to, I think, remain critically minded, but in that line of thought, Grush saying, well, we're not going to leap to conclusions about what we're dealing with, we just say non-human intelligence, also seems to say we may know less about this phenomenon than we actually think we do. So to note that parallel to the modern dialogue, I do find to be very interesting.
And we're talking about, it's interesting that you brought that up, the language that's being used in some of these very public conversations. We're talking about terms that were brought into large public acceptance in part by people like John Keel, in works like The Eighth Tower and Creatures from Beyond Time and Space, hardly what many would consider to be academic works, and yet here we are with congressional representatives using some of that same terminology. And that's what I think is interesting about this case, is it does kind of have that connection that makes us stop and go, what are we actually talking about here? Is the verbiage that's being used important, or are they just trying to avoid saying aliens?
Well, Stone strikes me as very careful with language across the board. And that goes back to the very definition of the program, descended foreign space vehicles. He's careful to say in interviews that you can take that in more than one way, foreign being non-United States, which is how it started, ostensibly, but then also foreign can also mean unknown. So that those are two things happening at once. And his whole progression of thought was, at first we thought we were retrieving just Soviet technology, right? But then it became apparent that we were retrieving other things as well. And so the careful language just seems to belie this sort of growing realization that what we're going out there to retrieve, we don't know where it's all from. And in a sense, and he goes far beyond this, of course, but that's not our job per se. Our job to say where it's from. Our job is to go get it and bring it back.
Yeah.
And let somebody else figure out where it's from. Even though his experience led him to see what he could only conclude were non-human bodies and even living beings.
And that seems to be his account, is that he wasn't fully clued in as to what he was dealing with here. And that's another recurring theme we see in a lot of these cases with these purported former government operatives who are dealing with compartmentalized information. You only know what you need to know. You don't need to know where the thing came from or what it does. You just need to go get it out of the woods. Seems to be the general narrative with this guy.
And language also shapes reality. So by what they're telling the general public, they're also compartmentalizing what we know as well.
Good point.
And I think, too, it's interesting, this started with, the Foo Fighters in World War II. And so they're going to these crash retrieval sites in other countries. Our soldiers are collecting this, bringing it back. And so Project Moondust or Blue Fly, it was known also as Blue Fly, they were looking at these crash retrievals and bodies way back before, the earlier than the Roswell. Well, Roswell was in 47. Take
Roswell
that back.
was 47.
47. So this was after Roswell. So
Project Moondust is occupying this very interesting space where it's prior to the entry of even Soviet spacecraft.
that's
with
right.
Sputnik, certainly prior to our entry into space, coinciding with the earliest Air Force investigations into UFOs. So the question would seem to be, yes, perhaps the intent here is to collect foreign vehicles, but almost preemptively expecting that Russia is going to be potentially putting things into space. And so years ahead of the actualization of that, we're prepared and we have a unit that's designed to acquire these things. But the interesting alternative interpretation there is, could there have already been some precedent for the expectation that things would fall from the sky, i.e. that in 1947, something may have already occurred, and that this is the impetus for the establishment of a Project Moondust. Briefly, about how we know about this program, I mean, it's fascinating to me. I first read about it in the book Clear Intent by Barry Greenwood and Lawrence Fawcett. And of course, they are a couple of FOIA warriors. Back when the Freedom of Information Act process first came out and was available to the American public to try and have a new way of leveraging information and also holding the government accountable through the release of information that we the people and as taxpayers kind of have a right to an extent to know about, right? And the ability to be able to access. So they start filing requests. We had landmark instances where massive troves of FBI files were acquired by Bruce Maccabee, the optical physicist and ufologist. Greenwood, Fawcett, the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, or CAUSE, was an organization that was really instrumental, I think, and some of the researchers, Brad Sparks and Peter Gersten and others who were with that organization over the years, they were all not only filing FOIA requests to get information about UFOs, but also at times filing lawsuits against agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and others to try and get those files that were not released. That could be an interesting discussion in itself. But through this process, Project Blue Fly, Project Moondust, and certain others too, start trickling out. And so the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy initially put out the word. They said, we'd like to know if any of our fellow researchers in the community know anything about this Project Moondust. What is this program? And sure enough, there was a researcher who happened to be a real great Roswell researcher, Robert Todd. And Robert Todd had been digging into Project Moondust pretty deeply, and so he passed along what he had to CAUSE, and these documents began to trickle out. And some of the documents are fascinating. I mean, they describe foreign objects that have fallen not on U.S. soil, but in other countries. We have information that's been relayed back to U.S. intelligence officials about, spherical objects that fall from the sky. In one instance, one of these troves of documents that now you can find online, John Greenwald has archived them at the Black Vault. They describe a spherical object that fell and burned for like 4 or 5 days after it fell to the earth. Now, what these are, again, maybe to an extent still remains in question, but this is what's fascinating to me. You can't dispute that there seems to have been a program. Moondust is explicitly referenced on the documents, and a lot of researchers have been collecting these now for decades. So clearly, there is a program that did involve actual technologies falling to Earth. And all of this coinciding with the entry into space by Americans and Soviets, but also the establishment of our UFO investigation. So that's a very interesting kind of trifecta of factors right there.
I think a good question is, are these programs still going on today? I mean, we have Blue Fly, Moondust, and then Sign, Grudge, Blue Book, and then the MUFON, of course, the Mutual UFO Network always states, we took over in 1969 when they closed the books on Blue Book. But, I mean, it makes sense to me that even MUFON, for example, is still working within the confines of Congress and that, and we know that these reports are being looked at, so I don't think these projects ever ended. I think they continue on to this day.
Kevin Randle, of course, in his book, Project Moondust, he says exactly that he thinks that the program, maybe under a different name, is continued. One final thing I'll just say about that. After Blue Book, right, Blue Book ends and MUFON begins, right? Civilian investigators pick up the task of investigations. As recently as, maybe around 2015, you could go to defense.gov, and the DoD's website said, as you may know, we're no longer involved in the investigation of UFOs. As we didn't know at the time, the Defense Intelligence Agency had a little program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program. There was some $22 million in taxpayer funding that went to funding this program. This program was very involved in the study of UFOs, and they also leveraged resources of, guess who? MUFON.
Right.
And so while the DoD was telling us they weren't, they were investigating UFOs. So yet again, when we're told that these programs have ended and are probably no longer in operation, they probably are, or at least some equivalent probably is.
I think that's a reasonable stretch that we can, not even a stretch, I think that's a reasonable assumption. And this kind of takes us to a point where we have to distinguish whether or not we're talking about Project Moondust and the concept of crash retrievals in general, and when we're talking about the testimony of Mr. Stone. And as always, I don't think it's our job and shouldn't be our task to debunk anybody, but there are additional aspects to Mr. Stone's story that have caused many to question some of what he's said. In addition to the crash retrieval program, which seems reasonable based on what we've said, Stone would say that he was held for 2 months against his will, pending approval of his retirement as he was departing and separating from these programs. There may be reasons for the military to delay processing someone's retirement. If you've ever known someone in basic training who left basic training early, they sometimes stay for a while afterward while the paperwork is done. Could be something like that. But Mr. Stone would go on to describe a trip he made to the Pentagon after leaving the program. He was contacted by a former coworker at Moondust who said, "Hey, meet me at the Pentagon." When he got there, he encountered someone he did not know who said, "Your friend is a little tied up right now." He then gave Stone a tour of an underground complex in the Pentagon where he met an actual alien being who communicated with him telepathically and hypnotized him or something to that effect. So we kind of run into something we've seen in these conversations before where we start on some ground that is verifiable. We know that Moondust existed. That, I don't believe, is in dispute. Then it gets a little bit more exotic, and then we have this figure kind of at the center of it who takes us into even more exotic territory. So what do we think?
Well, once again, we're talking about somebody who had a UFO experience of their own. And in Stone's case, it was when he was 7 years old. He was outside in the summertime, and he saw what he described as a white disc. This was a bright summer day, but as a little boy, he saw it, and he says, that kind of set me on a path. So you've got somebody not just studying this in sort of dry academic terms, but they have an experience of their own in their background that is sort of pushing them forward towards whatever else they encounter. You mentioned the experience at the Pentagon, and I found that fascinating as well. He said that what sticks with me is that he looked into the eyes of this being, and he said, it's as if in a moment it read my thoughts, or it read my whole life, like what we mean when we say my life flashed before my eyes. That's what he felt happened in this transfer of memory or information, and then the next thing he knows, he was waking up in the office that was back up on the surface level. Absolutely fascinating. And I think that it informs then, whatever that experience was, it informs his message. Because what I found, I didn't know this at all, but Stone had a very clear message that he's trying to send in his post-retirement appearances and interviews and so forth. And I think that goes hand in hand with what we're talking about here, is a singular person having an extraordinary experience. He's talking in other interviews, talking about, hey, there's 57 alien species. What do you think of that? And going on then to say very serious things like, the thing I'm concerned about is us taking the technology that we've gotten and going out into space with the ability to destroy worlds. He says we need to grow spiritually before we hit that point. So I think he's drawing on the real life consequences of, human technological advances, whatever's happening with these retrievals, and then using his platform to say, there's a lot of information that's been denied the American people. I think we have to advance as a human race before we start pushing out to other places too readily. So it's fascinating because he has sort of this well-developed point to his appearances beyond just being a whistleblower, beyond just saying, there's this clandestine program and I'm going to blow the lid off of that. He's got another thing going on there too, where he's very concerned with what are we going to do with all that we know in sort of the neighborhood of our solar system and beyond. So it's just an interesting twist on the usual messaging coming through this.
It is, it really is. And that's a message that we see mirrored in a lot of these other contactee cases, but very often that message is coming from the alien being in question. We talked about that a little bit, and there's more that we'll discuss. What Mr. Stone describes, it does sound outrageous, but again, we have connections to other cases about rumors of alien beings residing in government facilities, possibly even working in the Pentagon.
Maybe a little more could be said about Clifford Stone. I find him to be this kind of enigmatic character in all of this. If you watch some of the interviews with him and some of the accounts he provides, he is both one of these individuals who has this sort of austerity or even this sort of innocence in his eyes, not unlike Charles Hall. He also seems to be someone who found his way to the center of a lot of very interesting circumstances. One of the very first known recordings of a discussion featuring Clifford Stone that I became aware of was actually aired on Art Bell's Coast to Coast. It was recorded by Linda Walton Now, and Clifford Stone is describing an incident where he says one of these big black triangular craft appeared. I believe this probably would have occurred in West Germany during the Cold War, and he says that this craft comes in. Now, he says this thing is larger than a football field. He says it's like 3 times that size, comes flying in. He said over on the east side that they were aware of this thing as well, but from his position where they were looking at this, that there were craft that were dispatched to go up there and actually fly up alongside this craft, and it just kind of stops and hovers and waits, and that suddenly as everybody's watching this thing, people start getting sick and start suffering some sort of health effects from this thing. Now, I found that to be just a remarkable story. And then I began to wonder also in the context of all the other things that he'd been involved with. He'd had a early life encounter with a UFO. He had observed one of these massive triangles and had a military incident that even at the time, Art Bell, I seem to recall back on the classic audio saying, now that we should file a FOIA request about, right? And yet no documents have ever come out. Not to say that necessarily means it didn't happen.
Right.
But Stone kind of becomes one of these characters who's fascinating in the sense that he found his way to the center of so many interesting areas of ufology of that time. And like a lot of people who suddenly kind of, have a little to say about everything and have somehow been involved in everything, it does cause me to wonder at times, how credible are all of these claims? Whereas initially when I began to hear those, I thought, wow, this is just incredible. So I don't know. I mean, is that a reason to think maybe rethinking some of those claims is worthwhile?
Yeah, when you have that sort of just the facts demeanor, that helps plausibility, doesn't it? And I think that's one of the things that's worth rethinking. It's one thing to sound plausible and it's another to be plausible. And that's all that we're wrestling with here. I mean, on that same note, one of the most striking things he said to me actually wasn't about aliens at all, but he was addressing the question, can the government keep secrets? Because he was kind of addressing the question people say, well, how can a government filled with human beings possibly keep secrets of any sort? And just the way he delivered this was almost chilling to me, because in his deadpan way, he's like, oh yes, we can keep secrets. Absolutely we can. And it was like, he didn't elaborate. Wow. But he just said it with such certainty. And he said, when it comes down to it, there's about 50 people who control all the flow and release of information. It was just, again, his ability to state that with just sort of this is how it is, helps sell that as a possibility. And you're like, there must be something to this.
It starts to become much more human and relatable when we have a witness like that, as opposed to just, reading a breakdown of a case online or hearing a podcast about it, which was my initial exposure to it, was, through a podcast I enjoy listening to. But then once we talk about, again, the human being at the core of this, I think Mark illustrates that really well, it becomes a little more difficult to write off. Yeah.
And, again, on the other side of all that, we keep hearing these stories, very similar to what Clifford Stone described. I mean, most recently, again, and this has occupied the attention of Congress. And even though there seems to be some division in terms of what members of Congress and even the Intelligence Community Inspector General during a briefing that he gave to certain members of Congress recently, what they seem to think is credible and urgent, as had been deemed of the initial whistleblower complaint filed with the Intelligence Community Inspector General by David Grush last summer. You have that faction, and then you have the former leader of AARO, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who's kind of said, well, it seems like it's circular reporting, just a small group of people in government, and they all keep telling each other the same thing over and over again, and they believe that there's this cover-up, but they have no proof of it. He called it a self-licking ice cream cone. I hear that, and then I look at the decades of people, and I initially had been pretty skeptical, too, of the idea that, come on, is there really a secret being kept so dark, so incredible, such significance, and this involving acquisitions of foreign technology, not from over there, but maybe from up there. But with so many people seemingly coming forward with the seeming and apparent certainty and the conviction of people like Grush. And then finally, as an investigative reporter myself and someone who has met a lot of these people, spoken with them on and off the record, I keep hearing things too. And I think a lot of us at this point are having to look back at all this and saying, my gosh, what if people really are that good at keeping secrets? The secret has been kept, not that well. All right, not that well. We do see documents from time to time that seem to hint at these things. We do hear testimony from people who do seem to describe their involvement in these projects. We do hear from whistleblowers who say, my gosh, yeah, there is more going on, there has been more going on, and yes, our government does keep secrets. So it really does make you think, maybe people have been telling us about this all along. Right. And it just didn't reach a level of critical mass until maybe now we're nearing a point where, that truth is kind of coming out, and it's harder now to hold that dam up. Is the water going to really break through this time?
Yeah, I always say it's like a snowball gaining momentum coming down a hill with the internet and whatnot. And it's not hard to keep secrets. It's so compartmentalized, secrets can be kept. And these programs are continuous, and they're keeping a watchful eye on everything that's coming in.
But we have conjecture, again, coming from the recent hearings with Mr. Grush, that the U.S. government may have had knowledge of extraterrestrials as early as the 30s. So when we talk about there being a precedent for these crashed objects needing retrieval, we could be talking about almost a century at this point. My question, and this may be a little more skeptical, how often is this happening that it requires a designated program? How inept are these alien visitors that they are crashing this often? And it's a little bit of a joke. Oh, maybe Earth is a driver's ed course for aliens, but by the same token, if we're talking about outer space or other dimensions, we are talking about infinite variables and infinite possibilities. So those are I go back and forth on that with regard to these programs.
You have the Aurora case in Texas, right? That was the 8th hour of the Civil War, I believe. Yeah,
that was almost an episode.
Yeah, so we're going back pretty far there. And then, of course, it seems that they crash in conspicuous places, so at least they put themselves down in certain areas. Then we have the Kecksburg case, too, which was outside a fairly urban area. It was definitely a rural area where it crashed, but that was one of those things where if it was an alien spacecraft, it just missed from crashing into a city. But if they seem to be controlled crashes, if anything, because none of them are going down on a freeway or in a city or anything like that. And if that is indeed the case, then I think that's why sometimes you have survivors. And that's why people say that there's something still living.
Because I can imagine, we send unmanned probes into space. We do it all the time. It's very expensive and time-consuming for us, but let's assume that a civilization has advanced enough that they can shoot these things off into space at hyperwarp or something. I'm going to make several science fiction references over the next few sentences here. We think about the opening scene of Empire Strikes Back in the Star Wars series, where these unmanned probes are being sent all over the galaxy. So that makes sense if we're being observed by other species, even if it's only a couple, that they would repeatedly send unmanned probes, and who cares if they crash? They're easier for us to manufacture. It becomes more difficult when we start talking about living occupants,
And what is the purpose of that occupant, right? Is that their version of a dog or an ape being sent into space? Yeah, or were they designed to follow that kind of a role? And that all becomes very, that becomes intertwined with everything. But again, we're putting a human projection onto these things as well, too. But we just assume that an advanced civilization that has the wherewithal to do such a thing would be curious of other civilizations.
See, we have this this unfortunate and kind of disturbing thing about sending animals into space, dogs, or sending chimpanzees into space in the early era of the space program, because we were a little concerned about sending humans up there and having to have them go through the Van Allen radiation belts and see what's going to happen to them. But we're sort of okay with sending animals up there and having them be our guinea pigs, right? I mean, it's an unfortunate chapter in the history of space exploration. Now, if you could have an autonomous probe, or if you could have a remotely controlled robotic probe, as we do now, and this is one of the reasons, why don't we go back to the moon? We, as recently as, just a few days ago, as of the time we're filming this, We did. Just send an American spacecraft, and this one a private spacecraft, Odysseus, to the moon. But let's look at some of the facts here. Just before that, we'd had another attempt by a private company to get up there into lunar orbit, and there was a critical malfunction, and that mission ended up ending much sooner than expected. Odysseus, on the other hand, although it made its way to the surface of the moon, in that tradition of play acting, go break a leg, well, it did in the first act, and apparently a leg broke, the thing toppled over onto its side. It operated for a few days, but I think that mission's ending a little sooner than expected, too. So we crash our spacecraft pretty frequently because it's not easy to send that thing even as close as our nearest natural satellite and put them up there on the lunar surface. If you look back at the Apollo era, us getting to the moon and doing that carefully as we did and with the success rate we had, it's pretty remarkable. And so, the idea that some sort of exploration of Earth using what, we might liken to probes of some kind, that's not out of the realm of the possible. But, we send robotic probes, and in the past we've sent organisms other than humans. If we, yet again, look at what Philip Corso had said, if that's to be believed, he said, the biologics recovered from Roswell were part of the guidance system. We don't think those were actually beings, as in alien life forms, so much as some sort of engineered kind of biology that was intended to guide the craft. Could some of the recoveries have the appearance of biology to us in that Clarke's third law sense of, any technology so significantly advanced beyond our own would be perceived as magic? We perceive it as biology, or magical almost, but we're looking at essentially drones. We're looking at some sort of an autonomous system. And then there are some instances where it's actually said that that's what was recovered. 1930s, you mentioned. Grush has talked about this and brought it back into the public interest. The Italians had, prior to the Second World War, under Mussolini, apparently documents. And there are sources who have confirmed, and in fact there was a forensic investigation around the early 2000s that seemed to determine that these fascist UFO files, as they call them, were authentic. So dating back to the 1930s, I don't know about a crash. Grush alleges that there may have been a crash and that the U.S. was informed. As he's described it on Joe Rogan and in other interviews, it seemed to be kind of like a shell. There weren't any occupants, and that it had been kind of like a dome or a saucer, almost like a bell shape, right? That kind of conjures other imagery from the Second World War era. But that this had initially been acquired by the Italians and that the U.S. acquired it, and they weren't sure what this thing was. Initially, they thought maybe German technology of some kind, and they said, we don't think it belongs to the Germans. It could be something else. So it's hard to know how much of that's true. But that has been injected back into the dialogue, and that's why we go all the way back to the 30s and where that idea comes from. And then as far as what we're dealing with, it could be something that we don't even recognize as technology per se.
Right. And we rely, and it's just been out for a little bit, is artificial intelligence. You can imagine an advanced civilization that has an artificial intelligence we simply don't understand.
By Stone's reckoning, he was a participant in 12 saucer retrievals. 12. That is a lot.
What's the time frame on that too, for him?
The time frame for him, I really don't know. Whatever the length of his service was, it still is remarkable to have that many. So you're kind of in this strange area where, gosh, that seems like a lot for one person to be participating in. But then, of course, if they're at all, whatever intelligence is sending these or is occupying them, if they're anything like us, we get better at things, right? When something breaks, we try to figure out what went wrong and fix it so that it doesn't happen next time. That could potentially be the case.
There's no way to guess where these hypothetical civilizations are in their development. I think we think of alien beings that can travel between the stars, and we think, oh, it's an intergalactic empire, and there's another reference, and they know exactly what they're doing. But what if this is a planet closely adjacent to ours that we can't observe, and we're the testing ground for their new rockets, so they don't crash them on their own, cities? That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and they are collecting soil all the time, so maybe they're just at the basic ground.
And again, I feel like this can't be emphasized enough, because you'll have people who will conjecture in the media what the likelihood of us encountering aliens is, and the fact that we haven't yet means that we ever won't. We are talking about, as far as human beings can perceive, infinite numbers, infinite possibilities, just with the observable universe. That's not even accounting for alternate dimensions and string theory, which are things I'm not qualified to speak on intelligently, but they are concepts that are being discussed in academic circles. So it almost has that convenient paranormal cliche of being too big to write off. You can't debunk it because it's so big. But really, that's kind of what we're talking about here with any theoretical crash retrieval program of extraterrestrial craft. The numbers are so big.
I just have something I wanted to say about disclosure and what that means for each individual person. I mean, we often hear disclosure as, the president coming out saying, yay, we're not alone in the universe, or maybe they're landing on the White House lawn. But for me, disclosure would be the admission and the exposure of Project Moondust, Project Blue Fly, Grudge, and all that, and what really happened at Roswell. Each individual big case. What about the Phoenix site? Let's see everything you have on it. I think that's important to state.
Yeah, I don't think disclosure is going to be what most people imagine it's going to be. Everybody has probably a very lofty expectation that, we're going to see all the bodies, we're going to see all the technology. Disclosure may be the revelation that these programs did exist. In a few instances, we acquired some things, we just don't know what they are or where they're from, and that in itself is groundbreaking.
Right.
So if that's all disclosure ends up being, I would kind of be even more excited about it, in the sense that it's not this terrifying reality, they're bathing in our blood and killing our cattle. It's more like, well, we've got evidence of what probably are akin to Bracewell probes. Ronald Bracewell posited the idea that an intelligent civilization might take a space probe and plant it in a Lagrange point in orbit around a promising planet with life on it. And this probe basically just watches silently, covertly. But over time, as the denizens of this planet begin to start waking up and showing signs of intelligence, at the right moment, when some sort of a contact initiative is relevant and can be done peacefully, contact will be made. And it may not be made through, hello, we are here. It may be so simple as it intercepts our own communications and sends them back to us. And what's really intriguing is that if you follow the work of Duncan Lunan back in the 1970s, I mean, he was looking into this mysterious phenomenon known as long delay echoes, where from time to time radio transmissions will be sent and then they'll suddenly come back at a curious sort of delay. And theories have included maybe they were bouncing back off the moon or something along those lines. It still remains unresolved as far as I understand, but Duncan Lunan had said, what if this is a Bracewell probe? And it's actually taking our communications, as Bracewell had posited, and it maybe is sending them back to let us know, hey, we're here, we can collect your information, send it back to you, and let you know somebody's listening. So those all being hypotheticals, if that's all we found, evidence that somebody was here and that they'd been close by and they've been watching and listening, that would be one heck of a disclosure, if you ask me. And that may be what it actually ends up coming to pass as being. And I think people would be disappointed by that because show me them aliens. It's not what they wanted, but that may be the disclosure we need.
Right.
And by some of those criteria, hasn't that happened?
We're on the cusp of possibly, thanks to the James Webb Space Telescope, detecting biosignatures in the atmospheres of exoplanets. I mean, it seems imminent that maybe by the end of this year, possibly, we will have, a definitive sign of life out there. Now, that may not be intelligent life, but guys, the question of are we alone in the universe, by the end of this year, for all we know, could be answered. Let's wait and see, and then we'll have another discussion about that. But that's kind of what we're getting to. And so, yes, in that sense, we are really on the cusp of already answering a lot of these questions. But you extend that to some of the recent government revelations, it could go much deeper.
Well, depending on the timeline of when this episode airs, it could already be out there. So check your sources, folks.
I just wanted to make another point, too, seeing that this Project Moondust was established before we were sending things into space. And it was also Mr. Lazar that said there were some discoveries in an archaeological setting, right, or at least in an ancient setting as well, too. I think that would be fascinating as well, too, that, we are, where ancient civilizations had contact with extraterrestrials that may no longer even be visiting us. That's also a fascinating idea.
I mean, just what you're talking about right there, Ron, is incredibly important, I think, primarily because if we think about how long this universe has existed, some 13, 14 billion years, right? And then the shorter span of time that we've been here on planet Earth. If we look for signs of life out there and the astronomers say, guys, look, I know you want to believe in aliens, we don't see them out there. But at some point in those billions and billions and billions of years, I mean, the idea that there wouldn't have been intelligent life at some point that existed, it seems, just a strained credulity. And so the idea that Earth might have been visited long ago makes more sense in the sense of if you prescribe to the idea of the Big Bang at the constant rate of the acceleration and the expansion of the universe that astronomers are well aware of, and we can gauge this through things like redshift. As we know, the universe is expanding. Presumably, at an earlier time, the universe would have been a little closer together. Distances between celestial objects and regions in space would have been shorter. Maybe billions of years ago, an intelligent civilization could have come here. Maybe they left some things behind. Maybe an archaeological dig recovered something. Maybe they're no longer with us. They're more than just a forgotten remnant of a time long before we on this planet existed. But if we found that, here again, it's tragic because we're alone now, but that doesn't mean that life never existed in this universe.
Excellent.
While the idea of Project Moondust doesn't seem too unthinkable, and we do know for a fact that it actually existed, what it actually found will likely continue to spark debate and conjecture ad infinitum. What we find when we examine it, though, are questions about our place in the universe, what may be possible if we open our minds a little bit, and what exactly Clifford Stone experienced. These may be questions that will be solved another day, but for now, we reach the end of our discussion on Project Moondust.